Welcome to tonight's program, a discussion about sports, politics, and activism. My name is Marianne Danzeisen. I am your event host at the German American Center in Stuttgart, and we are offering tonight's discussion together with the Heinrich Böll Stiftung Baden-Württemberg. Some of you may have watched the Super Bowl earlier this month, and even if you didn't watch the game, you may have heard about the halftime show when Eminem took a knee at the end of his set, a gesture many saw as an act of solidarity with athletes that have knelt at sports events during the national anthem to protest racial injustice and police brutality. This goes back to former NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick, who in 2016 decided to quietly protest racial injustice on the field by taking a knee. And he was not the first athlete to make a powerful political statement like that. And we have experienced these protests not just inside the United States of America, but also here in Europe. And often these silence protests are not just an outcry against racism, but against any kind of discrimination. And only last year, there has been a big discussion here during the Euro Soccer Cup when German goalkeeper and captain Manuel Neuer wore a rainbow armband during the game against Hungary, causing a much larger debate about LGBTQ plus rights. And we have seen a lot of athletes also taking a knee on the field ahead of numerous soccer games here in Germany. And they've done so to support the Black Lives Matter movement and to fight systemic racism. And so to discuss the intersection of sports, activism, and politics, I am very honored to be here today with Dave Zirin, sports editor at The Nation, author of 11 books on sports and politics, and his conversation partner, Sumi Somaskanda, an American journalist currently working as a senior news anchor at Deutsche Welle News in Berlin. So Sumi and Dave, it's very nice to have you here with us. Thank you for joining us. And to everyone at home, before I hand it over to these two, just as usual, send us your questions, use the Q&A function. We are going to start with a 45 minute discussion, and then please type in your questions so we can get to them at the end of the discussion. Sumi, Dave, handing it over to you now. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Marianne, for the invitation to be part of this event, first of all, and to talk about this really important issue. It's close to my heart. I actually started my career as a sports journalist over in Chicago. And so this is a topic that I was really interested to delve into, and especially with Dave. So we heard a little bit of an introduction there, but I'll continue. Dave Zirin is really one of the preeminent sports writers, especially when it comes to the intersection of sports and politics. Dave is the Nation's sports editor, and I think it's worth saying that many of you might know The Nation as a leading progressive magazine, but it hasn't often had sports writers. So that in itself is something pretty unique and something to appreciate from Dave's work, and a prolific author as well. The author of 10 books. Most recently, the one that's the center of our discussion today is The Kaepernick Effect, Taking a Knee, Changing the World. And if you tune into US networks, you'll see Dave often as a commentator on ESPN, MSNBC, also on Democracy Now! And Dave hosts The Nation's Edge of Sports podcast. So Dave, it's a pleasure to be able to have this conversation with you.
Oh, it's an honor to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Great. Well, we can jump right in, and I'll just echo what Marianne said, that if you have questions for Dave, please do put them into the question and answer function, and I'll bring them in about 45 minutes as we get into our discussion now. Feel free to put them into the question and answer function at any point. So again, really, you're the best person to talk about this issue. And now we've just come off of the Winter Olympics in Beijing. And Dave, I know they're in the US and also here in Europe, particularly in Germany. A lot of questions were asked about the politics of allowing China to have the platform to host the Olympics, especially with the human rights violations surrounding the internment of Uyghurs. But there are a lot of issues we could touch on, but I want to start first of all with, of course, the centerpiece of your book, which is Colin Kaepernick. And Marianne mentioned already Eminem taking a knee. and what that brought up and what that recalled, if you will. So we have some people with us who might not be as familiar with Colin Kaepernick's story. So maybe you can start by telling us what Colin Kaepernick did, why, and what reaction that elicited.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, first of all, people have to go back to the summer of 2016 when people like Donald Trump were nothing but a gleam in our eye before the presidential election of that year. So it's the summer of 2016, and there were several cases of very highly publicized police violence in the United States, instances that were caught on camera and played and replayed on a loop on social media. The people killed were named Alton Sterling and Philando Castile. And their killings led to protests, and their killings led to outrage, and their killings led to a lot of people in the entertainment world, particularly athletes, to speak out, to raise objections on social media, to raise their voice on Instagram, to put up photographs of the people who were killed, to even take to the streets and march. And throughout this entire process, I was charting every athlete's social media feeds to see who was speaking out and who wasn't. And one person who was not on my radar screen at all was a certain quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers named Colin Kaepernick. He was not somebody who was making himself known throughout that very, very difficult summer of 2016. If anything, I was very clued into the athletes of the WNBA, that's the Women's National Basketball Association, whose season was going on during that early summer period before the 2016 Olympics in Rio. And these women were doing very brave actions during the national anthem. Like they were holding hands, wearing black t-shirts, covering up their uniforms. One of the best WNBA protests, even as a member of the media, I appreciate this, is that they pledged that they would not speak to the press. Several teams did this. The Minnesota Lynx did this definitely, or that they would not speak to the press unless it was about police brutality and racism. So people would ask them questions about the game, and they would not answer. And then they would ask them about the killings of people like Philando Castile, whose killing was in the Twin Cities where the Minnesota Lynx play, and then they would speak. So that's where my head was. And then in August, the story comes out that Colin Kaepernick sat, not took a knee, but sat during the national anthem of a preseason game. And this is in August of 2016, just so everybody has the timeline. And when he sat during the anthem, it was something that people largely did not notice. And it may have happened and gone 1 week, boom, boom. You know, people, if they noticed at all, might have assumed he was taping up or, tying his shoes or lost a contact lens. I mean, it could have been anything. But one reporter on site, someone I've become friends with, a terrific guy, Steve Weish, working at the time for the NFL Network, he saw what Colin Kaepernick was doing, and he thought something was up. And so he made a beeline for Colin and said, so you sat during the anthem. Was that political or was it anything? And Colin Kaepernick just went off. He said that there are people dying in the streets and police are getting away with murder, and he'd had enough. Now, that caused an explosion because it's one thing to have athletes in the WNBA protest, but people have to understand that the National Football League is the closest thing we have to a monoculture in the United States. It's the closest thing we have to a unified entertainment option in this era of streaming services and Peacock plus if you want to watch a show. I mean, we live in the most splintered times imaginable when it comes to how we consume culture. And yet the NFL alone on the sports landscape has been able to succeed in spite of that. Here's a statistic that blew my mind. Of the top 100 watched shows in the United States in 2021, 75 of them were NFL games. And there are no sporting events in the other 25. So that's what we mean when we talk about cultural hegemony. Like the NFL is the closest thing we have to a national language in this country. And the quarterback is by far the most recognizable position. That's the team leader. The mythology around the quarterback is so intense in the United States and their role as team leader. And so when you have somebody in the NFL, with all of its cultural capital and power, first sit during the anthem. And when you have that same person be a quarterback, well, I just say all that as a preamble to say that this story was absolutely volcanic. So then Colin Kaepernick realized, I think completely, it blew him away and completely shocked him, the amount of uproar that surrounded his sitting during a preseason game that he wasn't even starting. So he tried to figure out a way to mitigate the protest, because he was hearing a lot of people say, particularly on the radical right wing of the United States, that he's doing this against the troops. He's doing this against the country. And no matter how many times he said, no, I was sitting to protest police violence, they turned it into this statement that it was a statement against really the military of the United States. I mean, it was bizarre, but that's an old tried and true tactic in this country, in the United States. I mean, we're such a militarized society, frankly, that so many people have relatives in the military that if you say something that's at all a form of protest, people accuse you of disrespecting the troops. And Colin Kaepernick was feeling all of that. So he goes to a friend of his named Nate Boyer, who's a former Green Beret. So a former military guy who was also a long snapper. That was his position in the National Football League. And they came up with this idea of taking a knee during the anthem instead of sitting. So instead of sitting on a bench in the back of the team, taking a knee in front of the team. And they really believed that if they took such a position, one of the things that it would do was that it would show all the people who were outraged that there was actually respect involved, respect for the ritual of the playing of the national anthem, respect for the ritual of people seeing it as supporting the military, while at the same time, he was taking a knee to showcase his dissent. So there you have it. This to me is one of the most hilarious miscalculations ever. Like, they actually thought this would tamp down the attention, the concern, the outrage, but all it did was actually amp it up to a tremendous degree. And that's when Colin Kaepernick started something really remarkable. All 17 weeks of that NFL season, once a week, no matter whether he was at home in the friendlier confines of San Francisco, which is a liberal part of the United States, or if he was in a place like Buffalo or Texas, it didn't matter. He was going to take a knee. He was going to withstand the boos, the garbage thrown at him, the death threats, all the things he had to deal with. And he did it for 4 straight months. And after that, he found himself on the outside of the league looking in. I mean, I assume we'll talk about that some more, but he found himself to be a pariah. And, the legacy, of course, exists to this day because it's been 6.5 years. Eminem takes a knee, and all of a sudden, everybody is wondering, does this have to do with Kaepernick? Does this have to do with Kaepernick? If you or I took a knee at a sporting event during the anthem, no one would think we lost a contact lens. Right. The incredible essentiality and ubiquity of the gesture itself has given it a power that people have replicated across the United States at every level of sports. Now, that's an incredibly long answer.
It was a big question, though.
I apologize for that. And now I will stop talking.
No, it was a big question. Thank you for that overview. I think it's really helpful to put it all into context. I just want to drill down into one part of that. If you could talk about the significance of taking a knee during the national anthem. And I'm sure, Dave, you're aware that here in Germany, outward symbols of patriotism are still considered quite uncomfortable. And it was really during the 2006 World Cup that for the first time you would see German flags being waved here in Berlin, which was hosting the World Cup games, that became somehow allowed, at least within the context of the World Cup. So sports have allowed, in a way, some symbols of patriotism to gain some sort of acceptance again in German society. And you see that with Olympics as well. And I think it's important to note that in a very multicultural society like Germany, you see various athletes of immigrant background who can now drape themselves at the Olympics in the German flag. And that provides them with a sense of community and identity that they haven't always felt in their everyday lives in society. So maybe you could just tell us a bit about that specific aspect of the national anthem and kneeling.
No, absolutely. I mean, First, the United States history with patriotism is obviously it's far less fraught than it is in Germany. Although one could argue that given some of the crimes that have marked the history of the United States, from the transatlantic slave trade to the seizing of lands from indigenous people, it would be nice, frankly, if there was a little bit more humility in the United States when we celebrate the history of this country, because as Malcolm X said, we didn't land on Plymouth Rock landed on us. So it would be nice if that was recognized sometimes. I will say that. But the national anthem in the United States, it's interesting because it hasn't always been a part of sporting events here. But patriotism has always is deeply baked into the cake of sports in the United States. Because when I say sports, I specifically mean organized sports. Because organized sports in the US, sports leagues in the US, they come out of the Civil War, which was 1861, 1865. Following the Civil War, that's when you see the explosion of organized sports. So if you think about that context, sports were meant to provide a showcase for a newly reunited United States. So sports were meant to rally patriotism in what was still a very fractured nation throughout the end of the 19th century, particularly as the United States at the end of the 19th century starts to push outward into places, for example, all across Latin America and expand its reach. Sports were very much a rallying cry for the expansion of the United States West in the United States, even inside the country. So sports are so important. The people who created sports, they pressed on patriotism as a way to say to people, this is something that you should support. Organized sports are as American as apple pie. Baseball, in particular, is as American of apple pie. And from the very beginning in sports, you also have what I refer to as the myth of inclusion and the reality of exclusion. Because part of sports becoming so much in the part of the fabric of America and Americana is this idea that says, just like America, anybody who works hard enough and tries hard enough can make it. And the sports world is the great symbol of that. That's what people were saying in the 19th century. And they were saying this without shame. And I would think there might be a little bit of shame because women were denied any place in the world of sports. And Black and brown people were forced to create their own leagues because they were not allowed to compete inside the very segregated sports world. And yet still, they thumped this idea that said anybody who tries hard enough can make it. That's the myth of inclusion. And then, of course, you have, as I just described, the reality of exclusion. And so the entire history of sports has been people trying to have access to the playing field. And that's always made it inherently political. Who gets to play and who doesn't get to play? Who has access and who doesn't have access? That's a story that exists right now in 2022 in the United States, which I won't go off on a tangent to that because I'll stick on the national anthem. But even though you had so much patriotism involved in sports at the end of the 19th century, you don't really see the national anthem involved until World War I. And World War I, you have the 19 teens, you have the anthem start to play. Then it goes away and it comes back in World War II and becomes a huge part of sports during World War II. And then after World War II, you have the Cold War, the United States, the Soviet Union. And at that point, the anthem was adopted as a common thread in every sporting event, whether you were talking about Little League baseball or whether you were talking about the professional ranks, the national anthem was played. And it's worth noting that as early as, from my research, 1958, I believe, that's when you started to have athletes actually not stand for the anthem and protest during the anthem. So what Colin Kaepernick did wasn't new, but there was a track star named Roseanne Robinson who refused to stand in protest of the Cold War and the military buildup and the millions and millions of dollars being spent while there was poverty in the U.S. spent on weaponry and nuclear weapons. So from the beginning, the anthem was not from the beginning, but from the 1950s at the very least, the anthem becomes this very contested space, a political space. And you see that happen again at periods throughout sports history of athletes refusing to stand in protest of the war in Vietnam. In the 1990s, there was an athlete named Mahmoud Abdul Rauf for the Denver Nuggets who protested during the anthem. and he was protesting U.S. foreign policy. So what Kaepernick did, there's actually a tradition of doing that. But when Kaepernick did it, it caused such an explosion, unlike these other instances,
Right.
for many reasons that we could talk about. But there are a lot of reasons why when Kaepernick did it, it was like TNT and nitroglycerin wrapped with a bow around the gesture itself.
Well, that's precisely my next question, because you deem this the Kaepernick effect in your book. And as you said, it seems to have had really a lasting effect. And, it's not only something that seemed to have resonated across the US, and in your book, you talk about, the high school level of sports, the college level of sports, the professional level, so really across the strata, but also internationally. If you look just at the Euro soccer championships over the summer that were held a year later due to the pandemic, you saw several teams grappling with the question, should they kneel in protest of racial injustice? And the English team kneeled, and Germany actually decided to kneel with them ahead of one of their games. So it is still an extremely political, but also important, I'd say, gesture for many athletes, particularly because racism is such an issue facing so many teams. Soccer, as you know, is played here across the world, and we have athletes from around the world on the team, Black athletes who are playing across Europe as well, who often face racism in some of the games that they play. So yeah, what do you think it is that made that mix of Colin Kaepernick, who wasn't necessarily, a household name, and that political statement, what made it so controversial?
Well, the number one part of it that made it controversial, there are so many factors in it. One was you had the rise of Donald Trump's campaign for president. And Donald Trump, he has this incredible instinct for division and for demonization. And he immediately saw in Colin Kaepernick a target. And so it became part of his stump speech, saying that Colin Kaepernick should be fired from the National Football League. He even said he should leave the United States, which, saying that as a white presidential candidate to a Black athlete has a long history of just a brutally racist statement that's wrapped in that. That's what we call a dog whistle, something that, the people who want to hear him saying to Colin Kaepernick effectively go back to Africa, that's what's being heard for people who are inclined to hear that. And it was something that just it didn't just add fuel to the fire. I mean, it was like pouring great kerosene, because all of a sudden what Kaepernick did, it was no longer a sports story. And then they're asking Donald Trump's opponent, Hillary Clinton, well, what do you think about Colin Kaepernick taking a knee? Barack Obama had to comment, what do you think about him taking a knee? And a lot of that really was spurred by Trump. The other reason why it had such an impact is because you had the existence of the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States. And dating back really to the killing of a young man named Trayvon Martin back in 2012 in Sanford, Florida, not by a police officer, but by somebody who wished he was a police officer, who was stalking Trayvon Martin, and the demonstrations that followed. From that point on, you really had a movement that was calling upon people in culture and music and film and in sports to be part of the struggle. And so when Colin Kaepernick did what he did, it wasn't in a vacuum. There was a chorus of people who were there to celebrate, in fact, what he did. So you had Donald, it was one of those you can't be neutral on a moving train moments, because if you're an NFL player, you've got Donald Trump on one side saying that Colin Kaepernick should be fired. And on the other side, you've got a movement of people saying he should be supported, he should be defended, and all the rest of it. And that reached an even higher pitch when Colin Kaepernick could not find work in the aftermath of that season, and has been made a pariah, has been blackballed, or some say whiteballed, if you will, from actually being able to, have his job that he is eminently qualified for. So that was another part of it that led to a great deal of tumult. But the other thing, and this is really what my book is about, is that what Colin Kaepernick bequeathed to the movement is a gesture. Simple as that, an easily replicable gesture. So if you are an 8th grader in Beaumont, Texas, who's very upset about racism, it's not like you can go to the town square for the local Black Lives Matter demo. But what you can do during a football game is take a knee. If you're a cheerleader in upstate New York, what are you going to do if you're upset about racism? You could send a nasty tweet, or you could take a knee. And what these young athletes found is that by taking a knee, and when I say young athletes, I mean hundreds, if not thousands of young athletes, by taking a knee, they were able to spark conversations in their communities as well. They were able to create polarization. Well, actually, the polarization is racism, but they were able to start conversations about why their communities were so polarized in the first place. In some cases, the stories are very hopeful in that they were able to get people to look beyond their own narrow interests and actually take a moment and really try to walk in someone else's shoes and ask themselves, well, what does it feel like if you see a police officer and instead of feeling a sense of relief, you actually feel a sense of fear? Like, what does it mean to live like that, where the people who are charged with serving and protecting you are mortal threats to your safety? Like, how does that affect your entire mentality and approach to life? And so that's very positive. On the other hand, I think a lot of people taking a knee, it was also kind of like the proverbial canary in the coal mine, where I think a lot of what you're seeing today right now in the United States in terms of, and what you're having is like a very ferocious backlash against people who believe in racial justice, people who believe in teaching about the history of racism in this country. I think the ferocity of that backlash, we got the canary in the coal mine in terms of how some people responded to these young people taking a knee. But that's one of the reasons why Colin Kaepernick has, in a culture where sometimes our attention span is like kitty cats following a laser pointer on the ground, one of the reasons why it's had currency and staying power is precisely because so many people over the years have replicated it. I mean, ever since I've written the book, I get emails every week or texts every week from other people who are doing it in their small town. It's not being covered in the same way, but it's still there. And the people who are doing it, they're not doing it for internet fame or clout. They're doing it specifically on the most localized level to affect conversation in their communities. And on some respect, they're succeeding. In another respect, they're also provoking a lot of people to sort of take off their masks and speak with ferocity against the ideals of racial justice. So, that's where we are right now. It's a very fraught time. And one of the tools in the kit for people who want to push society forward can be traced back to the actions of a quarterback in the National Football League 5.5 years ago.
Just a really quick follow-up question on that before we get to the broader picture of sports and politics, because I want to underline that for people who, again, are not as familiar with Kaepernick's story, he has not worked, or he is not playing at the moment as a quarterback, right? So what has happened to him in his life?
Yeah, this is such an important question because it's not just about football and it's not just about his ability to play quarterback. It's about the issue of free speech and the ability of powerful people to shut down speech. And so on the highest possible cultural level, remember at the start of our conversation, we spoke about the way the National Football League is the closest thing to a monoculture we have in the United States. So at the highest possible cultural level, you have somebody who dared step out of line, dared step away from the very autocratic structure, the very vertical structure that the NFL operates upon, where you have owner, executive, coach, quarterback, players, and it's very top down and ordered. You had somebody speak out and step out of line in that structure. And so the people who run the National Football League, they wanted him to pay a price for that. And the price has been paid on a couple of fronts. And like I said, the point of talking about the NFL being this powerful cultural force is that one of the ways that it's affected people so strongly in this country is that people say, wow, if they could silence Colin Kaepernick, then maybe I could be next. Is it even safe to speak out in the United States of the 21st century? Those are all the questions that it raises for people, questions far beyond the football field. But for the people who run the National Football League, two very pertinent facts are: one is that they gave millions and millions of dollars to Donald Trump's campaign. So, and now here's Donald Trump, making this into an issue in his campaign. So that's one thing. The second reason is that I think the people who run the National Football League decided that Colin Kaepernick had more value as a ghost story than as a quarterback. He had more value as somebody that they could say to young players, you better stay in line. You better accept our very autocratic vertical structure of leadership. You better not speak unless spoken to, or else you'll find yourself on the outside of this league looking in. It's quite damning, truly.
That's such an interesting point, and I'm glad that you were able to touch on it. And I just want to say to our viewers, our audience, I see that some questions are coming in. Thank you. Please keep bringing in those questions, and I will check in on them in about 15 minutes or so. David, we can get to the question about whether sports are inherently political, whether athletes should be political. I am thinking of what Marian mentioned at the beginning, which was the Germany goalkeeper Manuel Neuer wearing this armband with the rainbow colors ahead of a game. And he received some criticism from the far right here in Germany, but otherwise it was a welcome measure. And just that was ahead of a match with Hungary, after Hungary had passed legislation essentially banning what they call LGBTQ content for kids in Hungary. And because of that, a group in Munich wanted to actually light up the entire stadium, the Allianz Arena in Munich, in the rainbow colors to show solidarity with the community. So it was a pretty important statement. And UEFA said, no, we can't do that because we are not a political organization. We don't want to make those types of statements. And it was interesting because during that match, one of the Germany players, Leon Goretzka, scored a goal and kind of made this heart symbol right at the Hungary fans, this kind of a big block of quite extreme, perhaps, and really vocal Hungary fans. And it was a big criticism of UEFA here in Germany at the time to say, of course, this is also political, but UEFA is now being asked whether they should move their Champions League final out of Russia, right? And they say they're monitoring the situation, but won't cancel it at the moment. So that's a picture here. But I guess the general question I'm asking is how political are sports and our athletes themselves?
I mean, when people say sports and politics shouldn't mix, what they're really saying is that sports and a certain kind of politics shouldn't mix. Because when it comes to the politics, certainly in the United States, of nationalism, of militarism, of using the money that sports creates by franchise owners to support political causes, using public money that goes to build stadiums that then get laundered through the pockets of some of the wealthiest people in the United States to support political candidates that many of their fans would find abhorrent. When it comes to all of that, politics and sports are just fine. It's just the way it is. It's when resistance politics enter the mix. And it's when players and fans say, hey, wait a minute, this is an incredible platform, this world of sports. What if we try to use it the same way that the billionaire owners try to use it, or the commercial networks try to use it? Why can't we use it that way? That's when you hear people say, oh, sports and politics shouldn't mix. And the right wing in this country is particularly hypocritical when it comes to this, because they called for Colin Kaepernick's head, but recently a very poor NBA player who goes by the name of Enes Kanter, and he changed his name to Freedom, Enes Kanter Freedom, who's been very critical of the NBA's relationship with China. He's also not a very good player, and he found himself going on Fox News here. It's a very right-wing network, and he started to speak out against other NBA players speaking out about politics and sports. He started saying that they should basically shut up and dribble. And now he finds himself outside of the NBA. He can't get a job. Like I said, he's not a good player, and he's not in the league. And the right wing has decided to call him, our Kaepernick, basically, and call out and say that there's a blackballing going on against Enes Freedom. And it's one of those absurd situations where it's like there's no ideological consistency. So when they say sports and politics don't mix, They're really saying sports and a certain kind of politics don't mix. If there's a player who wants to speak out for the causes that Enes Kanter Freedom speaks out to, there are many of the same people who call for Kaepernick's head will then support him. It's just brazen political hypocrisy, which has become de rigueur in the United States, to the depression of us all. Okay, but moving on from that in particular, I think we also have to look at history and say that it's impossible to imagine the early years of the civil rights movement in this country without thinking of Jackie Robinson, or it's impossible to think about the 1960s without thinking about Muhammad Ali. It's impossible to think about the women's liberation movement without thinking of tennis great Billie Jean King. And these people are really woven into the fabric of the great social upheavals of the 20th century as athletes. And similarly, it's impossible to think about Colin Kaepernick and the Black Lives Matter movement as two distinct forces, that these things are actually very, very intertwined. And it goes back to what we were talking about before, is that sports has always been political. It's always been baked into the cake of sports. And, for people who say sports and politics should not mix, that's like saying there shouldn't be chocolate in a chocolate chip cookie. It's something that you could say in theory, but it doesn't actually work. Or one of my favorite phrases that an old professor of mine said, you don't have to believe in gravity to fall out of an airplane. And it's similar. It's like, you don't have to believe that sports and politics mix, but it's also a kind of open denial of the reality of the situation. So I always say to folks, it's like, I love sports, because people ask me that all the time. It's like, is this just about politics for you, or do you actually like sports? And I love sports. I love seeing the limits or the limitlessness of what human beings can do on the field of play. I love seeing those limits tested. I love seeing, to me, it's art, it's ballet, it's music. Sports encompasses all of these things. But at the same time, I also understand that since sports and politics are totally intertwined, then the best thing we can do is try to be conscious sports fans and really identify what it is about sports that we would like to see changed, and then try to speak out in that regard, because the goal should be not to reject sports, but to reclaim it.
I can certainly say that obviously sports are just as political here. And if you look at some of the front lines of moving forward the debate on racism, some of the athletes here in Germany, again, have been really the pioneers in this field. And we've seen people like Rüdiger Antonio, who's on the German national team for the men, who has been really quite vocal and open, talking about the racism that he has faced as a Black German and growing up, but also on the field. So yeah, absolutely, I couldn't agree with that more. And I just want to follow up on the question of, you've mentioned that the NFL is like a national religion, if you will, in the US. How is it that certain leagues appear to be more politically progressive than others? If you think of the NBA and LeBron James, and the fact that the NBA, for example, opened stadiums as voting centers in the last election, and so on and so forth. And then you hear nothing from the MLB, from Major League Baseball, that is even in the direction of some sort of political activism. What are the different shades there?
Oh, there's so many interesting histories that hang over each league that create that kind of structure, that kind of politics, and that kind of history, and each one is very distinct. Major League Baseball, despite a history that includes people like Jackie Robinson and Roberto Clemente, has been a sport in recent years that's been very quiet politically, particularly in this era of the Black Lives Matter movement. And one of the reasons for that, and this goes for Major League Baseball and the NFL, is that they're trying openly to cater to fan bases that don't share the politics that everybody should have the right to vote, or that racism is a bad thing, or that police departments need to be brought to heel from enacting violence on poor communities. They're trying to actively build a fan base among people with those ideas. So that's going to make them much tougher on players who want to speak out. Similarly, Major League Baseball has undergone a profound demographic change over the last 30, 40 years, where the number of Black American players has dwindled at this point, I think below 7%, when it was once as high as 30%. And the number of players from most specifically the Dominican Republic and Venezuela, but primarily the Dominican Republic, has exploded in size, absolutely exploded in size. And players who come from the Dominican Republic tend to come from much poorer backgrounds. There is oftentimes a language barrier, and there's oftentimes a great pressure on them to not speak out, precisely because, I mean, if you took Major League, I read this study once about, people don't realize that the Dominican Republic supplies something like 1 out of every 7 players in the major league and minor league system. And it's a country that's roughly the size of population of New York City. So think about that for a second. Like, such a small country produces hundreds of professional baseball players, and the hit that the very Dominican economy would take if players spoke out and were pushed out of the game. I mean, so the amount of pressure that's on players in Major League Baseball to not speak out is something we don't talk about enough. The National Football League is run by right-wing billionaires. And so in addition of attempting to cater to fans like Major League Baseball, they tend to be, it's interesting, they tend to be old money. They tend to have owned the franchises for decades, if not more than a century. I mean, your roots in Chicago certainly know of the Hallis McCaskey family that owns the Bears, and that's a familiar story. These dynastic families that run franchises, and they tend to be extremely conservative politically. And when you throw on top of that the National Football League doesn't have guaranteed contracts, that a player can be cut at any time, it creates more uncertainty for the player and their ability to speak out. Now, the NBA is a little bit different. I mean, its fan bases tend to be more in cities. Its fan bases tend to be in more liberal parts of the United States. Even its ownership groups tend to be more new money than old money, and that at least makes a difference on some issues, if not all. But the NBA as well, it's interesting. I think that the only reason why the NBA has been more progressive in recent years, like there's some reasons, like there was a new commissioner named Adam Silver who's more politically progressive than his predecessor, David Stern. But what I really think changed everything in the NBA was after the aforementioned killing of Trayvon Martin, when you had LeBron James, the most famous, successful player of his generation, decide that he was going to be a political athlete. And he and the rest of the Miami Heat, they all posed wearing hoodies, which was the symbol of protest against the killing of Trayvon Martin. And that took place in 2012. And it really was the first viral sports politics photograph. Like the same way it went viral when Kaepernick took that knee, the first viral photograph was of the Miami Heat wearing hoodies. And I've always thought that LeBron James, you can't blackball LeBron James the way you did Colin Kaepernick. You just can't do it. I mean, you can't. So I always felt like what LeBron James did accomplish was 2 things. One is he bent the entire league towards being a more political entity. And 2, the mere fact that it was LeBron James who did this provided a kind of force field for all players who wanted to speak out, because it's a lot harder to witch hunt and get rid of the last person on the bench of the Cleveland Cavaliers when LeBron James is somebody who's prominent and political in Miami. So it changed the whole balance of power in the league in terms of who got to be political and who didn't. And yes, I think it made a huge difference that the commissioner of the league was Adam Silver and not David Stern, far less autocratic, far less wanting to crack down to smash player dissent. But, it's still this uneasy relationship in the league between, it's not all, fun and games in the NBA either. I mean, I think that's one of the things that the whole Enes Kanter freedom issue has kind of exposed, is that, the NBA wants to be progressive in a certain way. But if you're going to be a political league, then you shouldn't be surprised if people choose to use that platform to maybe espouse politics that are against what the power in the NBA really wants to express.
That's a really interesting point. And I know that particularly the NBA has a large following in Germany, and especially in the 90s when, all these NBA stars were flashing across screens. And before that, even in West Germany, before when Germany was still divided. And it makes me think of the fact that Michael Jordan was especially criticized or came under fire from the Black community for not being a political athlete or not enough supporting the Black community or fighting or giving a voice to the Black community's causes. But we do have some great questions coming in. So I'm going to ask you one more question and then start to bring in some of those questions. Are the stakes different for when white athletes versus non-white athletes decide to take a political stand? And I can certainly say that if you look at soccer again here in Germany, because that is kind of the national sport, like the NFL there, and certainly across Europe, it's the biggest and most important sport. It really takes an entire team to take a knee or to make a political statement, not one or two players.
Huge difference. I mean, I've interviewed so many players over the last 5.5 years about protests, taking a knee. And Black athletes invariably say that they wished or that they wanted, or in some small cases, they appreciated when their white teammates stepped up to be with them. And it's so much more difficult to scapegoat athletes when they do this on their own. It's a lot more difficult to punish teams. It's a lot more difficult to punish half a dozen people than it is to punish one or two. So the more players, the more solidarity, the better. It's like the old demonstration of the stick versus the sticks. It's easy to break one thin stick, but if I give you 10 of them, Arnold Schwarzenegger couldn't break them in two. So the more players that you have willing to step up, the bigger difference it makes. And the more white players they have, the more it confuses the narrative that the Donald Trumps of the world want to push forward, that there's this kind of Black incursion in this Americana space that is sports. It's like when you have a multiracial response, it makes it a lot more difficult to divide people. But I think on a different front, like if I could just say this, you've had a very interesting thing happen over the last few months with another quarterback in the National Football League named Aaron Rodgers. And Aaron Rodgers is somebody who decided he was going to become an anti-vaccine person. And as part of being an anti-vaccine person, he did some things that were pretty terrible, like lying to the media about whether or not he'd been vaccinated, and then walking around without a mask on. This is just activities that are, I would argue, morally abhorrent, and then be really playing the victim afterwards, like he was quoting Martin Luther King about how he was so oppressed and all these things like that. And and about how he was going to be punished because he dared stand up to the vaccine industrial complex and all the rest of it. Well, guess what? The NFL just voted him MVP overwhelmingly. And, so that just says something to me so strong. That's bigger than just Aaron Rodgers is more talented than a Colin Kaepernick. That's not it. It's about who gets to be political and who doesn't, and what kind of politics you're allowed to espouse and what kind of politics you aren't. If you're going to be a crypto right winger like Aaron Rodgers, it's a lot easier to function in that environment than it is if you're somebody speaking out for Black lives. And to me, that's very damning.
That's a really interesting point. And indeed, one of Germany's top players, Joshua Kimmich, came under a lot of fire as well, because he said that he didn't want to get vaccinated because he didn't know what the long-term effects of the vaccine would be, especially for himself as an athlete. And there was a lot of criticism of him and the German team for not enforcing a vaccine mandate among players. And it seems like the discussion around vaccines and COVID have opened up new battle lines, if you will, ones that are somewhat unexpected.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This is why my personal approach to this has actually, I have to say, served me well. Like I'm one of those people who says, throw the gates open. If somebody wants to be political, let them be political. Like being an athlete should not mean that you sign away your right to have politics. That means you occasionally get the Aaron Rodgers and the Enes Kanter Freedoms who say things that I find abhorrent politically, but that's okay. It's like, because they're actually representing a lot of opinion that's out there with their beliefs. So let them put them out there, and let's have the debate out in the public square. If you start picking and choosing, as I really like it when athletes are political on this, but not this, you find yourself tied in a knot of hypocrisy when somebody does say something you disagree with. So it's interesting. So it's like the vaccination issue has created some very odd bedfellows in the United States. It's just important that you have an independent politics of one has an independent politics of one's own, so you can analyze what actually is happening, instead of just being like, whoa, Kyrie Irving, last year he was speaking out for Black lives, this year he's refusing to get vaccinated, what does it all mean? And instead of just treating it like you would, like, I always think about like an athlete. It's like, imagine if they were like my uncle at Thanksgiving, and they said what they said at the dinner table, and it's like you respond even if they're coming at you from 3 different directions, because that's your responsibility.
Yeah.
Not picking and choosing.
Yeah, very good point. I'm going to bring in some of these questions now because we have a lot of great ones here. And I see that Anna Mia has asked a question that is along the lines of what I asked about some leagues being more political than others. And she asks, it always seems like the WNBA is more political than the NBA. For example, the protest of Atlanta Dream players against their owner, Kelly Loeffler. Why is that, in your opinion? I feel like the men would have a bigger platform and more financial security, like Colin Kaepernick, or yes. Am I mistaken?
No, that's a terrific question. And I mentioned the WNBA earlier in the talk as the precursor to Colin Kaepernick. I mean, one of the things about the WNBA is that the league very smartly, about 5 or 6 years ago, realized that many of their players were not just political, but very politically progressive. And some of that comes out of the lived experience of what it means to be a professional women's basketball player in the United States. You have to face sexism. For Black athletes, you face racism. There's a lot of homophobia against women athletes in the United States, whether you're straight or not. It's something that people come after you with, particularly in the world of basketball. So for a lot of them, they were frustrated by the league not providing more space for them to speak out. And I think the league, once they got a change in leadership, saw very smartly that not only should they, loosen up a little bit and tell players to feel empowered and to speak, but they also realized that they could develop a very loyal fan base through doing that in our hyper-politicized, hyper-polarized society that we are living in. And so I think all of that has made a big difference, which always made it to me kind of hilarious. Like, oh, excuse me about there we go. I was kind of hilarious about that Kelly Loeffler, who is this Trumpist, multimillionaire senator from Georgia. The fact that she was even in the WNBA family was surprising from the beginning. And then that she used her Senate run as a way to criticize the players on her team for speaking out for Black lives, for using the players on her team as people to hold up before a right-wing audience while she took selfies with members of the Ku Klux Klan and white supremacist groups. And then, of course, afterwards going, I had no idea who they were. And it's just such BS. It's this ridiculous kabuki theater that the right wing puts on in this country. It's like, but that's a separate question. On this question, what was so amazing about that story, you got to tell the whole story, is that a player on her team actually named Renee Montgomery, actually attempted to contact Kelly Loeffler and say, let's talk this out. You're demonizing us. And Kelly Loeffler refused to meet with her own player to talk about this, instead holding Renee Montgomery up as another reason that, white people should be scared and sports are being taken over. And what happened next was Kelly Loeffler, of course, lost. And then after she lost, a group of people that Renee Montgomery was a part of bought her out. So Renee Montgomery actually, in effect, became the new boss and kicked out the old boss. And that in and of itself is such a wonderfully WNBA story to me.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great answer. We have an anonymous question here asking, where is the line between activism and politics? Certain social issues like equal rights be common ground instead of being politically divisive?
Your mouth, God's ears is all I would say. So many things that I thought that I was raised to believe are common sense have now become open for debate. Like from women being able to have control of their own bodies to more recently in the United States, access to birth control. And whether that could, the very access to birth control, stuff that we thought was settled law in the United States is all of a sudden being thrown open for quote unquote debate. And I'm one of those people who thinks, why should somebody's very right to live be subject to somebody else's political whim or debate? That sounds incredibly barbaric to me, but all of this is now back on the table in the United States. It's the sort of thing where you look at other countries like Colombia just granted sweeping women's rights with regards to reproductive health, and you see the United States moving inexorably in the other direction. And so why do we debate people's right to exist? Because the other side is saying that they don't have the right to exist. So then you have the choice to either actually fight that out or turn your back and, bury your head in the sand. And I don't think we have that luxury right now.
Yeah, it certainly is a strange political moment in the US, that's for sure. Lena Funke is asking, do you think Kaepernick missed the chance to become the leader of a great political movement because he wasn't ready at the time? It seems like he has become more confident in the role of a political activist than he was back then.
There's a line from Shakespeare that I'm going to mangle where he said, some people are born great and some have greatness thrust upon them. Colin Kaepernick had greatness thrust upon him. Like, he didn't see this coming. And so I've always been, in my own mind, very generous towards him in terms of when people have said, well, why didn't he say this? Why didn't he call a demonstration? Why didn't he do this, do that? I mean, he was making it up as he went along. Like, he had no idea this thing was going to cause the uproar that it did. And it is true that in recent years, he was able to figure it out a little more. And there's a documentary that's going to be out soon that's being directed by Spike Lee. And I think that's also going to clarify some of the politics around this in a way that people are going to find, I think, very useful. Now, that being said, I also think that it's okay to raise criticisms about Colin and what he did or didn't do, or what he could have done or didn't do, as long as I think we also realize that he was in a situation that I think a lot of us would have found ourselves flailing for a way forward. And, I'm very close with John Carlos, the 1968 Olympian who famously raised his fist. I wrote his book with him. That's actually the poster from the book over my shoulder right there, of John Carlos raising his fist. And I'll never forget something John Carlos said to me about Colin Kaepernick that I found to be very profound, is that he said to me, when I raised my fist on the medal stand, it was the most powerful moment of my life, and I've been living it ever since for over 50 years. And it only took about 2 minutes. For Colin Kaepernick, he did this for 4 straight months. And I can't imagine the toll that must have taken.
Indeed. The next question we have from another anonymous attendee is, do you think the artists of the Super Bowl halftime show should have used the platform to protest the NFL's racist structures or racism in general?
I mean, the great Dr. Cornel West described it as a wasted opportunity. I'm inclined to agree with that. Not because I think that every musical act has to be political, not because I think every hip hop show has to be political. Rap music can be all kinds of things. It can be political, it can be dance, it can be fun, it can be romantic. I mean, rap has shown itself to be anything and everything. And you don't have to be political just because you put on a hip hop show. That being said, days before the Super Bowl, a massive racial discrimination suit was brought by a fired coach named Brian Flores. I mean, to not have something to say about that at the halftime show, I think was a wasted opportunity. I mean, Eminem took a knee, but we don't know why he took a knee. Actually, he hasn't come out and said so. there are some people from his camp have said, oh, he did it because as a tribute to Tupac. Other people think otherwise. I do think it's very interesting, though, that it also provoked a great deal of outrage on the right wing that he took a knee. And if you notice, it wasn't during the anthem. It was just during the show. So for all of their, how dare you disrespect the anthem, it kind of makes you ask yourself the question, well, was it really about the anthem? Or was it really about standing up to police brutality?
Yeah. A question is coming in.
I very much enjoyed. I very much enjoyed the halftime show. I want to be clear.
So did I. This millennial certainly did. It was made for, I think, people like us.
Yes.
We have the question: why did so few white players join the protests?
I think so few white players joined the protest because, first of all, a lot of white NFL players, I'm just speaking about surveys that have been taken, are very conservative politically. Which doesn't make them necessarily unusual. White men in the United States tend to skew very conservative. So why would we expect any different from white football players? That's one of the big reasons. And actually, I'm surprised that more white players didn't speak out against their black teammates. If anything, that shows the power of sports activism and as a way of breaking down racial barriers. Because anybody who's been on a team sport knows that you're often talked about being a family. And I think for a lot of athletes, it really was a consciousness changing moment to see some members of their family so upset that they would take a knee during the anthem and speak out to the press. And it gave them pause to speak out against their own teammates. So that was a good thing that you didn't see full out civil war on some of these teams. And you did have some white athletes actually step up, but not nearly enough, not nearly what we needed. But at the high school level, you did see a lot of white athletes, and that was reflected in the summer protests of 2020 after the police murder of George Floyd, where the demonstrations, which were the largest demonstrations in the history of the United States, were incredibly multiracial.
And we can pick up on that with the next question, which is asking, would you say that there's a lasting positive effect of the Black Lives Matter movement on sports concerning the NBA, the NFL right now? Can you see a positive and progressive effect of the Black Lives Matter movement in other countries, for example, in Europe? And you were just mentioning how widespread those protests were. There were huge protests here in Germany as well.
Yes and yes. I mean, we haven't discussed it much, but the history of racism and anti-immigrant racism in particular in European soccer is been well written about, well documented, and pervasive and ongoing. And when you have an entire team of people taking a knee, it's a statement to the fans in the arena themselves about like, okay, these are the politics that we represent. And, if you support us as players on the field, then you should support us when the uniform comes off. And so that is a very strong and ongoing effect. I mean, if people have talked for years, I've been doing this almost 20 years. And from the very beginning, I've heard people talk about like, how do you possibly change the culture in European soccer? How do you make it more open, less racist? Well, here's a way. They touched upon something. Whether or not it works, whether or not it is working, we can debate that. But at the very least, it's a line being drawn in the sand through this gesture and through the players' belief that they're amplifying a movement that's much bigger than sports. So, I do think it's had a lasting effect. I do think it's a positive effect. I think it's the equivalent of the wine being poured out of the bottle at this point. It's like we're not going to be able to pour it back in.
I have one more question here that's also an anonymous question. It's an interesting one. I'll read it out. It's a bit longer. In numerous articles, there is the conservative argument that sports in the US should be more entertainment and not political in order to reduce or not increase the high level of polarization between Democrats and Republicans. What do you think of this, and how is this argument being discussed at the moment? Has there been a shift in the public opinion that the articulation of progressive political statements is generally more accepted, or is the line of conflict primarily between Republicans and Democrats?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like, first, I wouldn't think of it as Republicans versus Democrats as much as I'd think of it as right versus left, because we have over, almost half the United States doesn't vote. and into people who consider themselves independent. It rivals whether they consider themselves Republicans or Democrats. So it's not neatly on party lines. But as far as like this country being incredibly polarized, and do athletes, and by protesting, particularly by protesting around a set of progressive ideals, are they adding to that polarization? The answer to that is, I would argue that the polarization exists already independently. And so I don't see what they're doing as making something worse as much as it is trying to point out that the polarization exists in the first place. The equivalent of somebody pointing at a burning building as opposed to them, throwing kerosene on the burning building. I think this is a case of athletes trying to be, the equivalent of Paul Revere saying the British are coming, like they're riding through the central town saying, hey, we gotta realize that this country is right now very broken. And I think the discussion as it's currently taking place among athletes is, that there is some weariness for sure with this era of protest and feeling like you can't just play your sport. But there's also a recognition that, with great power comes great responsibility. And there's a much more broad understanding that if you're going to have this incredible life of being a pro athlete, with that does come a burden as well of having to carry a certain set of ideas into this arena.
There is, and thank you for answering all of these questions, and also to everyone joining us in this group for these great questions. There's another one coming in from an anonymous attendee asking, a lot of athletes are very young when they enter the public limelight. You mentioned a lot of teenagers during the protests. Do you think the culture in sports around protest and activism will change in the next couple of years?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think people who are, first of all, it used to be a huge deal when an athlete would, quote unquote, come out of the closet and tell everybody that they're LGBTQ. I use this as just one example. Young athletes coming up, they don't have to really, many of them say to me, this isn't true in every case, I shouldn't paint it with too broad a brush, but many of them say to me that they or their teammates don't really have to come out of the closet because they were never in. So it's like this normalization of what it means to be an athlete from the LGBTQ community is something that I think is going to affect sports and be very different in the years ahead, just because culturally, these Generation Z folks, I mean, I just feel like this young generation is more demographically diverse and less tolerant of intolerance than any generation in the history of the United States. And they are going to be felt in the world of sports because they're just not going to be willing to settle for what their parents and grandparents were willing to settle for.
Okay. There's a question here on the Brian Flores lawsuit that you mentioned in the NFL. And the question is, do you think if more Black players chose the legal way to fight inequality, something would really change? What has to be done to change the racist structure of the NFL and other sports leagues for that matter?
Well, you go back to the civil rights movement and the Black freedom struggle, the legal strategy has always been an arrow in the quiver, so to speak. And I do think that part of it is very important. I think going to Congress is very important. Having hearings is very important. I think protests is very important. It's all part of one package that is not just aimed at the kind of legalistic structural change, but it's also, I think, a kind of public airing out of grievances that provides another lever of pressure against these leagues, because all these leagues, this is the dirtiest secret in American sports is that the audience of every major sport, including the NFL, is aging. It is an aging audience. And so if they want the young person who's making TikTok videos to tune into a week 7 game between the Cleveland Browns and the Cincinnati Bengals, they can't look like they're putting forward a racist product, because young people are just not going to want to engage with that. They don't have the captive audience they did when I was growing up and there were only 5 channels. It's those days are quaint and those days are done. So I think that all of this is on the table, the legal strategy, the protest strategy, and the public shaming strategy, because that's a real lever of power as they hope to survive and not be mired in what is a true existential crisis. of
That's
existence.
such an interesting point. I didn't have that on my radar at all, that the demographics are not in favor of sports like the NFL, or leagues like the NFL rather. But that would be interesting. I'm actually not familiar with what the numbers are here for football, for soccer, but I'd be curious to see what that would reflect. And then there's the question here, if you have an example of athletes whose activism generated an actual political change.
Sure. Where do we want to begin? I mean, we went through, actually, I'll just do one quote. Martin Luther King Jr., he said of Jackie Robinson that he was a sit-inner before sit-ins, a freedom rider before freedom rides. Billie Jean King, through the creation of Title IX legislation in the United States, and we're about to hit the 50th anniversary of Title IX, which opened up doors for women in sports by the tens of millions, is somebody who we should recognize as one of the great change makers of all time. Muhammad Ali shifting opinion against the Vietnam War. I mean, the examples are all over the place. And, pushing forward to today, I think as people push for some form of police accountability, and we'll see if we get there, but it's going to be remembered that the world of sports had their voice on this important fight.
Thank you for that answer. And again, to all of our attendees for those great questions. I would say, there is one question or a comment to say, thank you so much for the really interesting conversation. What's your next project?
Great question. There are always more projects to do. So I think I might keep it under wraps a little bit, because I've got some stuff brewing on a couple of fronts. But, I will say that as soon as contracts are signed and book projects are in motion, and I would love to share with you and with everybody what's going on. My Twitter is @EdgeOfSports. If people have any questions, I'll leave my DMs open for today after this event. And I'd love to keep the conversation going.
That's great, Dave. And somebody's asking if you have any plans to come to Germany. I'm sure with the pandemic, it's not the easiest, but.
It's not the easiest, but it's totally a bucket list thing because I've never been to Germany. And one of my closest friends teaches German in Canada, actually, and he's goes back and forth every year. So the stories I've heard from Munich to Berlin are beautiful. And so I would love to come to Germany, and maybe if anybody listening to this has a couch, let me know.
I'm sure something can be done, and don't forget to make Stuttgart on your list there, because that would be a visit to the center that's the Deutsch-Amerikanisches Zentrum Stuttgart. So that would be great to do another event, to follow up on this.
Right. I meant to say Stuttgart. I apologize to my wonderful hosts.
No, but we can, it would be wonderful to have you here, Dave, and do a follow-up on this talk. There's always political issues in sports to discuss. It has been really, as the attendees said, a really illuminating talk. And I think a lot we can take away from this, and also certainly to look forward in getting your book, for those who haven't gotten it yet, to look into as well. At this point, I'd like to thank you and everyone who's been with us. And I'd ask Marian from the Deutsch-Amerikanisches Zentrum if she'd like to take over again.
Thanks so much to both of you. I guess I can only second what Sumi said. Dave, if you have a plan to come to Germany, we would be honored to host another event with you. This was super, super interesting. I can also just encourage everyone to purchase your book. I tried this before with the background. It's a bit hard, but it is wonderful. And we also have it at our library if you want to check it out. To all the guests at home, thanks for staying with us, for asking all these wonderful questions. As always, if you're interested in our programs, you can also follow us on Instagram, YouTube, Facebook. Check out our homepage for all the upcoming events. We do have a couple of online events still in March, but fingers crossed that we can actually host some of you in person also for some of the events. So please stay tuned. Also, of course, thank you to our cooperation partner, the Heinrich Böll Stiftung. And yes, thanks so much again. It was a real pleasure, and I hope everyone has a good night, and I will see all of you next time. Thanks.